As the sun dipped below the horizon, the grand mansion perched on the edge of Crescent Bay stood as a silent witness to the horrors unfolding within. Shadows stretched across its cold marble floors, reflecting the dark secrets that hid behind its luxurious facade. Inside, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of a young boy's desperate heartbeats and the distant echoes of pain too terrible to speak aloud. Leo Rivers, trapped in a house that should have been a sanctuary, was about to face a nightmare far worse than he ever imagined. Someone would pay for the brokenness that plagued this house, and that someone was not who anyone expected. Before we dive into the story, leave a comment below and let me know which city you are watching from. Let's get started. The sun was just beginning to sink beneath the horizon, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the massive house perched on the edge of Crescent Bay. The mansion, an architectural marvel, stood in stark contrast to the turmoil that raged within its walls. Its marble floors and sweeping staircases, its grand chandeliers and polished windows, none of it could mask the decay lurking behind the pristine surface. Inside, it was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers or the distant hum of Andrew Rivers' latest tech deal coming to life. But in that moment, the silence was suffocating thick with secrets and unspoken pain. It was the kind of silence that tells you everything is broken, but no one dares to speak of it. At the heart of the mansion, 12-year-old Leo Rivers sat alone in the dimly lit living room, his fingers gently brushing the keys of a dusty piano. The once majestic instrument, a gift from his late mother, now sat in disrepair, much like Leo himself. The boy's small hands trembled as he pressed the keys, the soft notes filling the room with a mournful melody that felt both ancient and raw. He had stopped playing for months, ever since Isabel had moved in. But something deep within him pulled him back to it now. Maybe it was the hope that the music would soothe him, or maybe it was because in the quiet sound of the keys, he could almost hear his mother's voice again, whispering from the shadows of his mind. Leo's world had become an endless loop of loneliness, confusion, and fear. His father, Andrew Rivers, was a man consumed by the pursuit of success. A self-made millionaire who had built an empire from the ground up. Andrew's life had been one of cold logic and even colder decisions. He had retreated into the comfort of his work, burying himself in endless meetings and business deals. After his wife Sarah passed away from a brutal battle with cancer, Andrew had drowned his grief in work, convincing himself that providing more wealth for his son would somehow fill the void that had been left behind. But Leo knew deep in his bones that money could never replace the warmth of a mother's love, or the steady hand of a father who truly saw him. In the weeks after his mother's death, Leo had watched as his father became a stranger, a ghost, haunting his own home. And then came Isabel, a beautiful cold woman who wore the mask of a loving stepmother. Isabel's entrance into their lives had been swift, a blur of promises and smiles that quickly turned to thinly veiled threats. To Andrew, she appeared as a savior of sorts, a way to heal his broken heart. But to Leo, she was a nightmare disguised as a fairy tale. From the very first moment, Isabel made it clear that she saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience, a complication in her plans to secure her position in the Rivers family fortune. Isabel's cruelty was subtle. At first, small digs masked as discipline or training. She would scold him for the smallest things, his posture at the dinner table, the way he folded the laundry, or the amount of salt he used in his dinner. Her words, though smooth and composed, always had a sharp edge, like a blade concealed beneath velvet. "Don't be such a lazy boy, Leo," she would say with a sickening sweetness, as though she were bestowing some great favor upon him. "You have to learn how to be a man someday. Your father needs you to be strong." But what Leo needed more than anything was not strength, it was love. And love was something Isabel had never been willing to give him. The emotional abuse began to wear away at Leo's spirit. Every day he came home to find Isabel's perfect smile waiting for him, and every day he felt smaller, less important, as though he were fading into the background of his own life. And Andrew, blind in his grief and distracted by his business ventures, failed to see what was happening to his son. How could he? Andrew was too busy, too consumed with building his empire to even notice the slow decay of his family. Leo had come to realize that his father wasn't just absent, he was actively choosing to be absent. It was easier that way, he thought. Easier to pretend that everything was fine, to bury the pain of losing Sarah under layers of corporate deals and high-rise offices. But Leo couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape Isabel's coldness or his father's indifference. It was as if the walls of the mansion were closing in on him, suffocating him in a place that should have felt like home. His safe spaces had all but disappeared. The piano was one of the last places where Leo could still feel some semblance of peace, but even that felt distant now. Leo's only solace came from Maya, his mother's best friend. Maya was everything Isabel wasn't: warm, understanding, and full of life. She had promised Sarah that if anything were to happen to her, she would look after Leo, and Maya had kept that promise even from a distance. Every so often, Leo would find the courage to send Maya a message, asking for help, though he never fully understood how to articulate the pain he was feeling. Still, Maya would send back comforting words, reminding Leo that he wasn't alone, that he had a place in this world, and that one day the weight of everything would finally lift. Leo had become good at hiding his pain, putting on the mask of the obedient son, for his father playing the part of the polite, quiet boy who didn't rock the boat. But in the silence of the mansion, in the hollow emptiness of his own heart, Leo knew the truth. His father didn't see him. Isabel didn't care about him. And most tragically, he couldn't seem to care about himself anymore. It was during one of these long, lonely nights, as Leo sat hunched over the piano, that everything began to shift. The house had been eerily quiet that evening, Andrew off to another business dinner, and Isabel locked away in her private study. Leo had thought about playing his mother's favorite song, something light and gentle, something that would bring him comfort. But as his fingers began to play, a surge of emotion overcame him. The chords of the song shifted, becoming more complex, more desperate. His hands moved faster, almost frantically, as though the music was trying to scream what he couldn't say out loud. And then, like a sudden crash of thunder, the door to the living room slammed open. Leo's heart nearly stopped in his chest. There stood Isabel, her expression dark and livid. Her eyes bore into him like daggers, her lips curling into a smile that held no warmth, only contempt. "You think you can just escape into your music?" She sneered, her voice cold and cutting. "You think you can just ignore everything that's happening around you? You're not special, Leo. You're just a boy who doesn't know his place." Leo's hands froze on the keys. The music stopped the silence, suffocating once more. His stomach churned with fear, but he stood his ground, his eyes meeting Isabel's with defiance for the first time. "I'm not the one who needs to change," Leo said quietly, though his voice shook. "It's you." Isabel's smile faltered for just a moment, and for the first time, Leo saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by her usual coldness. "Don't test me, Leo," she hissed. "You'll regret it." Leo didn't respond. He couldn't. Instead, he stood up, leaving the piano behind. As he walked past Isabel, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. But there was something else, too, a small spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It was hope. Hope that maybe he wasn't as powerless as he thought. The storm was beginning to brew. Leo could feel it in the air. Something was about to change, and for the first time in his life, he was ready to face it. The night had been long darker than most. Leo lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with the words that had been spoken earlier. Isabel's cold sneer, her calculated cruelty, it all replayed in his head like a broken record. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept soundly without the haunting echoes of their arguments or the feeling of being watched. It was as if he had become a ghost in his own home, existing only in the spaces where no one cared to look. The once comforting hum of the mansion, its grand staircases and open windows, now felt like a prison. Every corner held a memory of something lost: his mother's laughter, his father's absence, the warmth that once defined this place, but had long since faded away. He turned over, pulling the thin blanket tighter around his shoulders, trying to drown out the rising swell of anxiety in his chest. Leo had never been one to cry easily, but tonight something inside of him had cracked wide open. He was sick of feeling powerless, sick of being invisible in his own home. Isabel had always made him feel small, insignificant, like a child who didn't deserve the same respect as the adults. She had a way of twisting his every action, making it seem like he was the one at fault, even when he did everything in his power to please her. But tonight was different. Tonight Leo had stood up for himself, however quietly. He had done what no one had ever expected him to do. He had let the truth slip from his mouth. It had been a small statement, a defiant whisper, but it felt like a declaration, a small victory in a world that had only ever known his defeat. The hours dragged on the stillness of the night, pressing in on him. He wanted to believe that things could change, that his small act of rebellion could ripple out into something more, something bigger than the confines of this mansion, than the prison Isabel had built. But Leo knew better than to get his hopes up. Every time he thought he had a sliver of freedom, Isabel's iron grip would tighten, squeezing the life out of him until he was back in his place. His mind drifted back to the only person who seemed to care about him, Maya, the one constant in his life. Maya had always been there, even when the world around him fell apart. She was his mother's best friend, a woman with fire in her eyes and a heart that knew how to fight. Maya had promised his mother that she would look after him if anything happened. And although he'd never expected much from anyone, Maya's words still rang in his ears like a lifeline. "I'll be here when you need me, Leo. Never forget that." But it had been so long since he'd reached out to her. How could he possibly explain everything that had happened? The fear, the isolation, the way Isabel had slowly started to chip away at his sense of self. How could he tell Maya that his father, the one person he should have been able to turn to, was so caught up in his own pain that he couldn't see the suffering of his son? Leo felt the weight of his guilt like a stone in his chest. He had tried so hard to protect his father from the truth, but in doing so, he had only made things worse. Andrew Rivers, the successful tech mogul, had been drowning in his own sorrow ever since his wife's death. Leo understood that in a way. Grief could make you do strange things, make you blind to everything that wasn't your own pain. But it didn't excuse the way Andrew had treated him. Leo had spent years trying to earn his father's attention, his love, but nothing seemed to work. He'd tried being perfect, tried hiding his flaws, tried being the model son. But the more he tried, the more distant his father became, until Leo had given up trying altogether. Yet, despite everything, there was still a flicker of hope inside him. The small moments when his father's eyes would soften, when Andrew would look at him, like he was actually seen, those moments kept Leo going. But they were rare, few and far between, fleeting like the last rays of sunlight before night fell. Tonight, Leo had seen that softness again, but it had been overshadowed by Isabel's cold manipulation. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough until Leo could find his own voice, until he could stand up for himself, in a way that his father would understand. His fingers absently traced the edge of his blanket, his thoughts spiraling. He wanted to escape. He wanted to break free of the suffocating walls of this house and run far away. But he couldn't do that, not yet. Not when the only person who might help him was someone who hadn't even seen the truth of his suffering. How could he ask for help when he wasn't even sure if anyone would believe him? How could he face Maya, someone who had cared for him all these years, and tell her the truth, that he had been trapped in a home, with a stepmother who didn't care about him, with a father who was too blind to see it? Leo's mind swirled with questions, but there was one that rose above the rest, louder than all the others. Could he trust anyone? Could he trust Maya? Could he trust his father? The truth was, Leo didn't know. He didn't know what the right answer was, but he knew he couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. And so as the hours ticked by and the stillness of the mansion pressed down upon him like a heavy weight, Leo made a decision. The first step he realized was to stop being afraid of what would happen if he told the truth. He didn't know where the courage had come from, but it had been building inside of him for weeks, for months, maybe even longer. It had started with small, quiet moments of defiance playing the piano, when Isabel told him not to ignoring her orders just a little longer, just enough to reclaim a sliver of his life. But tonight, when he had stood up to her, when he had spoken those words to his father, Leo had crossed a threshold. He had taken the first step toward freedom, and he wasn't going to let fear stop him now. The next morning, the house was just as cold and imposing as the night before. The mansion had a way of swallowing up people, of making them feel small, insignificant, like they didn't belong. The vast rooms felt empty, without the sound of laughter, without the presence of love. Leo could feel the absence of his mother in every room, in every corner. She had been the warmth that had filled this house, and without her it felt like everything had crumbled. But today, there was a sense of resolve inside him, a quiet determination that had taken root during the long, sleepless night. He wasn't going to let the mansion swallow him whole. Leo slipped out of bed and dressed quickly, his fingers moving with a sense of urgency. He didn't know how to do it, didn't know what would come next. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stay in this house any longer. He couldn't let Isabel keep him caged. He couldn't wait for his father to see the truth on his own. He had to act. With his heart pounding in his chest, Leo grabbed his phone and sent Maya a message. "I need your help. I can't do this alone anymore." He hit send, and as the message left his screen, he felt a strange mix of fear and relief wash over him. It was done. There was no turning back now. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if his father would ever see the truth, or if Isabel would continue to weave her web of lies and manipulation. But Leo knew one thing. He was ready to face whatever came next. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel completely alone. The days that followed felt like an eternity for Leo. Each hour dragged on, weighed down by the quiet tension that permeated the house. He couldn't stop thinking about the message he had sent to Maya. Couldn't stop wondering if she would even be able to help, or if she would think he was just another scared child looking for someone to fix his problems. But what if he wasn't just scared? What if he was finally starting to see that he wasn't powerless, that he wasn't trapped in this mansion, forever bound by the rules and manipulation that Isabel had enforced? Leo had spent so many years being quiet, trying to disappear into the background, trying to appease his father, trying to keep the peace. But peace was a lie. And now the truth was beginning to break through like a floodwater too powerful to hold back any longer. It had been 2 days since he sent the message, and nothing had changed. Isabel had continued her usual routine, acting as if nothing was wrong, her charming facade never slipping her poisonous words always wrapped in the most sweet-sounding tones. Leo could feel her eyes on him cold and calculating every time he stepped into a room. She was watching, waiting for him to make a mistake, for him to slip up, so she could remind him of his place. His hands had started to tremble again. Every time he saw her, his heart raced, his thoughts tangled in knots, his breath shallow. It was as though the mere presence of her in the room was enough to freeze him in place, enough to make him question whether he really could break free, whether he could expose her for what she was. But then that morning something changed. He was in the kitchen, the floor cold beneath his bare feet, trying to make himself a quick breakfast before he went back to his room. It had been a quiet morning, one of those mornings where the world outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The house was still and empty, save for Isabel, who was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. Her red dress, the one that always seemed to catch the light just right, was perfectly pressed, the pearls at her neck glimmering faintly in the morning sun. She looked like she had stepped out of some glossy magazine. But to Leo, she looked like a stranger, a woman who had no place in his life, a woman who was as foreign to him as the walls that enclosed them. Isabel didn't look up when Leo entered the kitchen, didn't acknowledge his presence as usual. But her silence felt different this time. It wasn't just the usual coldness, it felt heavier, more oppressive, like a storm was brewing in the distance. Leo didn't say anything either. Instead, he busied himself with the mundane task of making toast and brewing some tea, pretending not to notice the way her eyes flickered in his direction from time to time, as though she were calculating her next move. Leo couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking, if she had somehow sensed his growing resolve, if she knew he was on the verge of doing something he hadn't dared to do before. And then, without warning, the moment came. Isabel spoke, her voice breaking the silence like a sharp knife. "You know, Leo," she said, her tone smooth, almost lazy, "you could do a lot more around here. Your father works hard for this family, and yet all I see is you sitting around wasting your time." Leo's hands froze, the knife he had been holding slipping from his grip, clattering against the edge of the counter. He had heard her say these words before, over and over again, but today they landed differently. They didn't carry the sting they once had, the weight of guilt she had so carefully piled onto his shoulders. Today they felt hollow. Isabel didn't see him. She never had. She had never once tried to understand the pain he was living with, the things he was enduring. Leo turned to face her, his heart pounding, his breath shallow. For the first time in a long while, he met her gaze without flinching. "I'm not a servant, Isabel," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "I'm your stepson." The words left his mouth before he could stop them, and the moment they did, something shifted in the air between them. Isabel's eyes narrowed, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second, and for the first time in years, Leo felt like he had the upper hand. He wasn't the one trapped in a corner anymore. For a brief moment, Isabel said nothing. The air in the room grew heavy with tension, thick with unspoken threats and simmering anger. But then just as quickly her smile returned, though it was colder this time, edged with something darker, something far more dangerous. "Don't forget your place, Leo," she said, her voice like ice. "You may think you have power now, but trust me, you don't. You never will." Leo's stomach twisted, but he didn't back down. He had heard those words before countless times, but this time they didn't scare him. This time they only fueled the fire burning inside of him, the fire that had been kindled with every small act of defiance, with every moment he had spent quietly rebelling against the control Isabel had over him. "We'll see about that," Leo said, his voice low but resolute. As he turned away to gather his things, the sound of his footsteps felt louder than ever, echoing in the silence of the kitchen. Isabel didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. The message was clear. But Leo knew one thing now: he wasn't going to let Isabel win. He had spent far too long letting her control him, letting her twist his every action, his every thought. But no more. Maya's message still lingered in his mind, a reminder that there was someone out there who cared, someone who was ready to help him break free. And as he stepped out of the kitchen and made his way to his room, he knew it was time to take action. It was time to end this charade. It was time to expose Isabel for the manipulative, cold-hearted woman she truly was. And he wasn't going to wait for his father to figure it out on his own. Leo had already waited too long for that. In the hours that followed, Leo spent his time carefully planning his next move. He knew he had to be smart about it. He couldn't risk alerting Isabel to what he was doing. She would retaliate, and it wouldn't be pretty. But he was done hiding. Done pretending. He thought about the message he had sent Maya. He didn't know when she would respond or what she could do, but he had to believe that there was a way out. There had to be. He couldn't live this way any longer, and he certainly couldn't let Isabel destroy his father any more than she already had. As he sat at his desk, gathering his thoughts, a sudden realization hit him. He didn't have to do this alone. Maya had promised his mother, but she was more than just a promise. She was a force, someone who would fight for him. Someone who knew how to navigate the world of power and manipulation that he was trapped in. If anyone could help him, it was her. And as Leo sat there in the quiet of his room, surrounded by the stillness of the house, he made a vow to himself. He would no longer be invisible. He would no longer be afraid. Isabel's reign over this house was over. The walls that had once held him captive now felt like a stepping stone to freedom. It was time to face the truth, and it was time to fight for what was rightfully his. The following days blurred together for Leo, each one dragging on like the last, yet something inside him was changing, hardening. His resolve was no longer fragile, easily shattered by Isabel's ice-cold words or the empty silence of his father. The small victories he had started claiming, the quiet moments of defiance, the way he no longer cowered when Isabel's gaze landed on him, became the foundation of a much larger plan. Every step he took away from Isabel's control felt like a reclaiming of his power, like he was becoming the person he had always wanted to be, strong, independent, and free. But freedom came at a price. And Leo could feel it creeping closer every day. Maya had been quiet since he sent the message, but he knew that she was planning her next move. He had to trust her. She had always been there for him, a silent guardian in the background, someone who knew how to handle the kind of trouble Isabel had brought into his life. Still, as the hours passed without a response, Leo's mind began to race. What if Maya couldn't help him? What if Isabel had too much power? What if his father still didn't see what was happening, still didn't believe him? The thought of it gnawed at him, but he couldn't afford to let fear drive his decisions now. He had already waited too long. He had already been too silent. It was late one evening when Maya's reply came. Leo had just finished his dinner, a quiet affair in the kitchen, his father still nowhere to be seen. Andrew had taken to leaving the house for hours on end, his excuses more frequent, his presence more distant. Isabel had also been preoccupied, her attention fixated on some event or gathering that Leo couldn't bring himself to care about. So for once the house felt like his own, empty, yet his to control. When Leo checked his phone, his heart skipped a beat as he saw the message from Maya. "We need to talk. Come to my office first thing tomorrow morning. I've made some calls." The weight of those words hung in the air like a breath held too long. "I've made some calls." It was a promise that something had shifted, that Maya was ready to act. And Leo knew in that moment that he couldn't wait any longer. He had to confront the source of all his pain, Isabel, and he had to do it before she could destroy everything he was trying to build. The next morning, Leo didn't wait for the sun to rise before he slipped out of the house, careful to avoid Isabel's watchful eyes. He left a note for his father, though he wasn't sure if Andrew would even see it or care. "Gone for the day. I'll be back soon." That was all he wrote. He didn't want to explain himself to his father. He didn't need to. What he needed was to see Maya, to hear her plan to take the next step in what had become his silent war against the woman who had twisted their lives into something dark and suffocating. Maya's office was a small, quiet space, tucked away in an old part of the city far from the bustle of Crescent Bay. The building had once been an old factory, now converted into a row of offices. It had the kind of charm Leo had always admired, practical and plain, but full of history. When he arrived, Maya was waiting for him in her usual spot behind a large wooden desk, papers scattered in front of her, her dark eyes filled with purpose. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy ponytail, fell loosely around her shoulders today, a sign that she had been working non-stop. "Sit down, Leo," she said, her voice warm but firm. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think it's time we go straight to the heart of the problem." She pushed a folder across the desk to him. "I've already started gathering evidence. Your father's name is attached to a few things that could help us, but we need to move fast. Isabel has been playing the game too long, and now it's time to expose her for what she really is." Leo glanced down at the folder, his mind racing. What was Maya planning? What had she discovered? He had always trusted her, but now in this moment a new kind of fear crept into his heart. What would happen when the truth finally came out? Would his father finally see what Isabel had done to their family? Or would he be too far gone, too entrenched in his grief and his new life to care? Maya must have sensed his hesitation, because she leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. "You don't have to do this alone, Leo. This isn't just about you, it's about your future. It's about protecting yourself and making sure that Isabel doesn't get away with what she's been doing. She's been manipulating your father, your entire family, for her own gain. And it's time she faced the consequences." Leo swallowed his throat dry, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of her words settled over him like a heavy cloak. He had known Isabel was dangerous. He had known she had power over his father, that she controlled him with her charms and her threats. But hearing Maya lay it all out so plainly made it feel real, too real to ignore any longer. He picked up the folder, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped it open. Inside, there were pictures, photographs of Isabel with various high-profile people. Her smiles polished her posture perfect. But it wasn't the images that made Leo's heart race. It was the documents, legal papers, contracts, notes from meetings he had never been privy to, but that clearly tied Isabel to decisions that had far-reaching consequences. It was all laid out for him in black and white proof that Isabel had been orchestrating something behind the scenes, manipulating his father's business, steering them both into a future that would leave Leo with nothing. "This is just the beginning," Maya said, her voice steady. "I've contacted a few people who can help. We're going to bring this to light, Leo. But we need to be careful. We need to move in a way that forces Isabel's hand, that exposes her to your father. He has to see what she's been doing. He has to understand that she's been using him to get to his money to control everything he built." Leo nodded, his mind spinning. He could feel it now, the rush of adrenaline, the fire that had been simmering inside him for months, finally coming to a boil. He wasn't just a bystander in his own life anymore. He was a participant. He was taking control. "I'm ready," Leo said, his voice quieter than he expected, but laced with conviction. "I'll do whatever it takes. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. I need to confront her. I need to show my father the truth." Maya smiled, though her eyes remained sharp. Good. You're stronger than you think, Leo. Now we just need to make sure we have everything in place before we make our move. The next few days were a whirlwind. Maya's contacts came through, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Leo was no longer alone in this fight. The evidence he had now was irrefutable. Isabel's manipulation, her control over his father's wealth, her ability to sway everything around them to her advantage. But the most damning part, the part that would expose her for who she truly was the discovery that she had been siphoning money from the business, funneling it into accounts that Leo had never seen. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about greed. Isabel had been setting the stage for something much bigger than Leo had ever realized. And so when the moment finally came to confront Isabel, to force her hand, Leo felt a strange calm wash over him. The pieces were set in motion. He was no longer a passive observer in his own life. He was an active participant. He had made the decision to fight. And he would do whatever it took to ensure that his father finally saw the truth. He just hoped it wasn't too late. The day of reckoning arrived with a quiet urgency that gnawed at Leo's insides. He had known deep down that it would come to this, that one day he would have to confront Isabel, face the full scope of her manipulations, and finally put an end to the reign of fear she had imposed on him and his family. But even as he prepared himself for this confrontation, a strange sense of calmness washed over him. He wasn't the same boy who had once hidden in the shadows of his mansion, terrified of his stepmother's wrath. He wasn't the same boy who had cowered under the weight of his father's emotional neglect. No, this was a new Leo, one who had discovered his strength in the darkness, who had grown into the kind of person who could not only stand up for himself, but who could also demand justice for what had been taken from him. Maya's plan had been set in motion. The evidence was ready, every photograph, every legal document, every financial transaction that proved Isabel's manipulation, her greed, and her cruelty. They had waited for the perfect moment to strike, a moment when Isabel would be least prepared for the storm that was coming. And now, with everything in place, Leo felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about protecting his future, reclaiming his voice, and ensuring that his father could no longer be blinded by Isabel's lies. Leo stood in the front hallway of the mansion, his heart racing as the familiar hollow silence of the house surrounded him. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long, thin shadows across the floor. He had always hated how cold the house felt, how distant and disconnected it seemed from the warmth of family. But today, as he stood there ready to confront the woman who had torn his life apart, something inside him clicked. The house didn't own him anymore. It didn't control his fate. He was no longer bound by the walls that had once felt like a prison. He was stepping into the world with a strength he had never known before, a quiet resolve that ran deeper than the fear Isabel had so expertly cultivated in him. As he made his way to his father's office, his mind raced with what he was about to do. This wasn't just about exposing Isabel for the greedy, manipulative person she was. It was about something much more personal. It was about confronting his own father, the man who had been absent for so long, who had buried himself in work and grief, too blind to see the abuse his son had suffered under Isabel's hand. Leo had spent years waiting for his father to notice, to care, but now he realized that waiting for someone else to act was never going to bring change. If he wanted a life of freedom, of love, of connection, he would have to be the one to create it. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly, but not from fear. It was a tremor of anticipation, of readiness, of the weight of what was about to happen. He opened the door, slowly stepping into the room where his father spent most of his time, where his business decisions were made, and his empire was built. Andrew Rivers sat at his desk, his back to the door, staring out of the large window that overlooked the bay. The man looked older than his years, the weight of grief and responsibility etched into his features. His once sharp, ambitious eyes were now clouded with sorrow, and his posture slouched as though the world had slowly worn him down. Leo hadn't seen his father in this way before. This man who had built so much, who had been so driven, was now a shadow of the person he used to be. "Dad." Leo said, his voice low but firm. Andrew turned slowly, his face lighting up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Leo, you're up early. Everything okay?" Leo took a deep breath. The words he had rehearsed in his head, the arguments he had planned, the questions he had hoped to ask, all seemed to dissolve in the face of his father's hollow cheer. How could he even begin to explain the years of hurt, the years of silence to a man who had been so lost in his own pain? But then he remembered Maya's words. You don't have to do this alone. He had a purpose now. He had a voice, and he would not be silenced anymore. "I need to talk to you about Isabel," Leo said, his heart pounding as he stood his ground. "About what's been going on. What she's been doing to both of us." Andrew's face tightened slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he stood up from behind the desk and walked over to Leo, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture that should have been comforting, but felt empty in that moment. "Leo, I know things have been difficult since your mother passed." Andrew began, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "I know I haven't been the father you needed me to be, and I'm sorry for that. But you've got to understand, Isabel is just trying to help me. She's been so good to me. To us. No, Leo interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp, the words coming out before he could stop them. "She's been manipulating you, Dad. She's been lying to you. And I've been living in this house suffering because of her. You don't see it. You haven't seen it. But I've been trying to tell you for so long, and now I need you to understand." Andrew recoiled slightly, the shock on his face evident. "What are you talking about? I don't know what you mean, Leo." Leo's eyes burned with a mix of frustration and determination. He couldn't let this go on any longer. He couldn't keep hiding, pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. He had been silent for far too long, and it was time for the truth to come out. "I've been gathering evidence," Dad, Leo said, his voice growing more confident. "Isabel has been siphoning money from your business, manipulating your deals, using you to get what she wants. She's been pretending to care about us, but she doesn't. She never has. She's been using you to build her own life, to control everything, while you've been too busy to see it." Andrew stepped back, his face paling as the words hit him like a punch to the gut. What are you saying?" "This doesn't make sense, Leo." "It's all here," Leo said, pulling out the folder Maya had given him, the evidence that would expose Isabel for who she truly was. He handed it to his father, watching as Andrew's hands trembled slightly as he took it. Leo's heart raced as he watched his father sift through the documents, his eyes widening in disbelief with every page he turned. For the first time in years, Andrew Rivers looked directly at his son, and in that moment Leo could see something in his father's eyes that had been missing for so long: clarity. Understanding. You're right," Andrew said quietly, his voice breaking as the weight of the truth settled in. "I've been so blind. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it." Leo felt a pang of something between relief and heartbreak. He had known deep down that his father was a good man, that he wasn't beyond redemption. But that didn't mean he could simply forgive him for the years of neglect, for the silence, for the way Andrew had let Isabel control everything. This moment was a long time coming, but it wasn't enough for Leo to just have his father's regret. He needed more. "It's not just about you, Dad," Leo said softly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "It's about me too, about our family. We can't keep letting her tear us apart. We have to do something about this before it's too late." Andrew's face crumpled with emotion. and for the first time in a long while, Leo saw his father for who he truly was, a man who had made mistakes, a man who had failed his son, but a man who was finally ready to change. "I won't let her do this anymore, Leo, I swear it." Andrew said, his voice thick with regret. "I failed you, but I won't fail you again." And in that moment, Leo knew that the battle wasn't over, but it had just begun. There would be challenges ahead. Isabel wouldn't go down without a fight. But for the first time in years, Leo felt hope surge inside him. His father was with him. They were in this together. It wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. The lesson that emerges from this story is one of resilience, the power of truth, and the importance of standing up for oneself in the face of adversity. Leo's journey is a testament to the strength that lies within each of us, even in the darkest of times. For years he endured emotional abuse, lived in silence, and watched as his father, trapped in his own grief, failed to see the damage being done. Yet through his own determination, Leo found the courage to confront not only his stepmother, but also the painful truths that had been buried for so long. This story teaches us that no matter how insurmountable a challenge may seem, taking that first step toward confronting the truth, even when it feels overwhelming, is the most empowering action one can take. It also reminds us that healing is not just a matter of confronting external forces. It's about reclaiming our voice and understanding our worth. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we are too small to make a difference, that our voices don't matter, or that our pain is too great to overcome. But Leo's courage shows that every small act of defiance, every moment of standing up for ourselves, builds toward something larger. The path to freedom, whether from manipulation, fear, or even our own doubts, starts with the decision to say, "This is enough. I deserve more." And once we take that step, the world opens up in ways we couldn't have imagined. What makes this story especially powerful is its message about family. It isn't just about confronting an abuser, it's about healing a fractured relationship. Leo didn't just fight for himself. He fought for the chance to rebuild his relationship with his father, to restore what was broken between them. In the end, this wasn't just a battle for justice. It was a battle for connection, for love, and for the belief that people can change when given the right support and the courage to do so. This is a story about transformation, about how one person's courage can inspire change, and how even in the darkest times, there's always room for hope. For anyone reading this, remember that you are never alone in your struggles. There is power in telling your story, in reaching out for help, and in finding the strength to make the changes you need to move forward. Life may not always be fair, and the people around you may not always see your worth, but your value isn't defined by the opinions of others. Stand up for yourself, no matter how hard it seems, because your voice matters, your truth matters, and your happiness matters. I encourage you to reflect on the story of Leo and think about how it applies to your own life. Are there areas where you've been silenced, overlooked, or manipulated? What would it look like for you to reclaim your voice and take action? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below, or reach out if you feel inspired to talk more about your own experiences. Let's create a space for open conversations and mutual support. Thank you for reading and for sharing in this journey. I hope this story encourages you to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles in your way. Remember, like Leo, you have the strength to change your story.